Welcome to Ask the Lawyer radio podcast with attorney Brian Figueroa of the law firm Figueroa and Associates. This podcast features a recording of our most recent radio show aired weekly in New York City. We hope you enjoy the show, which features news, views, and interviews on matters such as immigration, personal injury, bankruptcy, divorce, family law, estate planning, wills and probate, deed transfers, civil rights, criminal defense, workers' compensation, and taxes, both individual and business. You can contact us at 855-768-8845 or visit us at www.askthelawyer.us. You have questions? We've got the answers.
Historical context of Guantánamo Bay. Detention practices and modern immigrant rights under President Trump. Guantánamo Bay, located on the southeastern coast of Cuba, has been under U.S. control since 1903. Its detention facility gained international attention post 9/11 when it was used to hold individuals captured during the War on Terror. The choice of Guantánamo was strategic, aiming to place detainees outside the jurisdiction of U.S. federal courts. Over the years, the facility has been synonymous with human rights violations, including indefinite detention without charge, lack of due process, and reports of torture. These practices have been widely condemned by international human rights organizations and have led to numerous legal challenges. Legal framework governing detainee rights at Guantánamo Bay. The legal status of Guantánamo Bay detainees is complex, influenced by a combination of U.S. constitutional law, international law, and specific legislative acts. U.S. constitutional protections. In the landmark case of Boumediene v. Bush, 2008, the U.S. Supreme Court held that detainees at Guantánamo have the constitutional right to file writs of habeas corpus in federal court. This decision affirmed that fundamental rights afforded by the Constitution extend to Guantánamo detainees, allowing them to challenge the legality of their detention. International human rights law. International treaties, such as the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, ICCPR, and the Convention Against Torture, CAT, to which the U.S. is a party, impose obligations to uphold the rights of all individuals under its jurisdiction. These include prohibitions against torture, the right to due process, and the right to a fair trial. Detention practices at Guantánamo have been criticized for violating these international norms. Recent legislative and executive actions. In recent years, executive actions have expanded the use of Guantánamo Bay for detaining immigrants. The Trump administration's policy to transfer immigrants to Guantánamo has been met with legal challenges and widespread criticism. Advocacy groups argue that these actions violate both constitutional and international law protections. Rights of immigrants detained at Guantánamo Bay. First, right to legal representation. One of the most fundamental rights of immigrants facing deportation or asylum proceedings in the U.S. is the right to an attorney. However, at Guantánamo, this right is severely restricted. Limited access. Unlike on U.S. soil, where immigrants can retain legal counsel, detainees at Guantánamo face barriers in communicating with lawyers. Denial of attorney-client privilege. Even when legal visits are allowed, attorney-client communications may be monitored or restricted. Lack of legal aid organizations. Most immigrants in detention rely on non-profit legal aid groups, which have no established presence at Guantánamo. Legal challenges have been filed to demand greater access to attorneys for immigrants detained at Guantánamo, arguing that these restrictions violate constitutional due process protections. 2. Right to seek asylum and protection under international law. Under U.S. immigration law and international treaties, individuals fleeing persecution, war, or violence have the right to seek asylum. However, asylum seekers detained at Guantánamo face barriers to exercising this right. No standard asylum hearings. Immigrants at Guantánamo are often not given timely hearings before an immigration judge. Inability to present evidence. Asylum seekers may be denied the opportunity to present evidence of persecution. Forced repatriation risks. Without fair hearings, some asylum seekers may be forcibly returned to countries where they face persecution, a violation of the principle of non-refoulement under international law. Immigration attorneys argue that the U.S. government cannot evade its legal obligations by detaining asylum seekers at Guantanamo. 3. Right to habeas corpus and due process. In Boumediene v. Bush, 2008, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that detainees at Guantanamo have the right to file habeas corpus petitions to challenge their detention. However, immigrants held at Guantanamo face significant legal obstacles, restricted access to federal courts. Unlike immigrants on U.S. soil, detainees at Guantanamo may not have direct access to U.S. federal courts. Lack of transparency. The U.S. government has not disclosed full details about the legal status of immigrants held at Guantanamo. Delayed or denied petitions. Some legal challenges have been delayed for years, leaving immigrants in indefinite detention. Immigration advocates continue to file lawsuits demanding that detainees at Guantanamo receive the same constitutional protections as immigrants detained on U.S. territory. Challenges in enforcing immigrants' rights at Guantanamo. Despite the existence of legal protections, immigrants detained at Guantanamo face unique challenges in asserting their rights. 1. Jurisdictional and legal loopholes. The U.S. government has historically used Guantanamo's location as a legal loophole to argue that constitutional protections do not fully apply. This argument has been rejected by the Supreme Court, but enforcement remains inconsistent. 2. Political and national security concerns. Guantanamo remains highly politicized, making legal reforms difficult. Some policymakers support expanding Guantanamo's use for immigration detention, citing national security concerns. 3. Lack of public awareness and advocacy. Compared to detention centers on the U.S. mainland, Guantanamo receives less media attention and public scrutiny, making it harder for advocacy groups to mobilize support. Legal strategies for representing immigrants at Guantanamo. Attorneys seeking to represent immigrants detained at Guantanamo can take the following legal steps. Step 1. File an emergency petition for habeas corpus. Demand immediate judicial review of the detainee's immigration status. Request access to legal counsel under Boumediene v. Bush. Step 2. Challenge detention through federal court. Argue that detention violates the Due Process Clause of the U.S. Constitution. Cite violations of U.S. asylum laws and international treaties. Step 3. Advocate for policy changes. Work with human rights groups to pressure Congress to provide greater legal oversight of Guantanamo's immigration detentions. Push for legislation to prohibit the indefinite detention of immigrants at Guantanamo. Step 4. Use international legal mechanisms. File complaints with the United Nations Human Rights Committee. Appeal to international human rights courts to demand access to due process for detainees. The fight for immigrants' rights at Guantanamo must continue. Guantánamo Bay has become a legal battleground for immigration rights, with detainees facing limited access to legal representation, restricted due process, and barriers to asylum. While past Supreme Court rulings have affirmed some constitutional rights for Guantanamo detainees, the U.S. government continues to exploit legal loopholes to deny basic protections. To ensure justice, attorneys, human rights advocates, and policymakers must work together to demand full access to legal representation for detainees, push for federal court oversight of immigration proceedings at Guantanamo, expose human rights abuses through media and advocacy campaigns. Without immediate action, Guantanamo will remain a legal black hole where immigrants are denied the fundamental rights guaranteed under U.S. and international law.
Are immigrants detained at Guantanamo Bay being denied their legal rights? The answer is alarming. Many asylum seekers and detainees are trapped in legal limbo with no access to attorneys or fair hearings. But they still have rights, and we can help. At Figueroa & Associates, we fight for due process, legal representation, and justice for immigrants, no matter where they are detained. If you or someone you know needs legal help, call us today at 855-768-8845 or visit www.askthelawyer.us for a consultation. No one should be left in a legal black hole. Stand up for immigrant rights with Figueroa & Associates, where justice has no borders.